Good afternoon. My name is Beth Kreppein. I am a Supervisory Special Agent with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I've worked with the FBI for 20 years now, and for about 18 of those, I have been a crisis negotiator for the FBI. I was also, in my career, I did 4.5 years at the Crisis Negotiation Unit, where I was embedded with the hostage rescue team deploying on crisis matters all around the world. But more importantly, I have taught crisis negotiations all around the world for local law enforcement officers who respond day in and day out to different crisis incidences. So today I'm going to talk to you about some of the basic skill set that we use as crisis negotiators that you could use in any part of your day-to-day lives, and perhaps even with your clients, maybe at home with your spouses. Never really works with children, I can attest to that, but it's always an effort to try. And certainly I like the interactive presentations that I give. So if you have questions along the way, please raise your hand, chime in here on Zoom, let me know, and I'm happy to answer any questions. Or if you have examples that you want to use or try to use these crisis negotiation skills, I'm happy to do that as well. The basic or regional crisis negotiation courses that we put on is a 40-hour course, and then we have an 80-hour course that is put on at the Crisis Negotiation Unit. So I have 2 hours with you, which means I am going to try not to talk too fast, but embed the two basic concepts that we like to look into: crisis intervention as well as active listening skills. I'm hoping that active listening skills is not a strange topic for anybody. Have you guys heard about active listening skills in your career? Yes, okay. So we're gonna use it a little different way, and I get very nuanced in how you use the different active listening skills with subjects or anybody in particular that you're talking with. First and foremost, I thought it was important to go over some, if the clicker can work, I apologize. Just go old school. No, I won't. That's not going forward, I apologize. And it's not doing either one. Somebody's video. I'm not sure if it's that, it's just not reading it. Making the birds.
Go back to sharing your screen. Right?
Mm-hmm.
Nope.
Yeah. There we go. Awesome. Great job. Okay. Did I say it's been 20 years since I've been out in the real world? I'm just kidding. So technology is not my strong suit. I miss rotary phones myself, but I don't. So wanted to start off with some of the myths that you may have with crisis negotiators in general and dealing with law enforcement. Number one there, we've all heard that we don't negotiate with terrorists. Have you guys heard the president say that many times? That's a misnomer. Negotiations are really communication. We will communicate with anybody, but we may not give you what you want is the key. So yes, we do negotiate with terrorists, meaning we do communicate with terrorists and pretty much anybody who is in a crisis setting. Negotiations means concession. It does not. Just because you are understanding somebody and accepting what they want or what they stand for, how they're feeling, does not mean that we're giving them what they want. Quid pro quo always. You see a lot of movies. I am not going to give up a hostage unless I give something in return, and vice versa. A lot of times on the reverse, you'll see law enforcement chiefs and captains say, I will not give them anything until they release somebody. And so it's that quid pro quo. Well, in negotiations, sometimes giving a bottle of water builds rapport. So we're not getting something tangible in return, but we're getting something that will help move those negotiations and communications forward. So think about that as you're talking to somebody. Maybe you're not going to give them exactly what they want, but if you give something that will build that rapport, move that direction towards an influence. Crisis negotiations are good BS artists. Try not to cuss when I'm presenting with professionals, but you know what that means, right? No, negotiators are good listeners. Ideally, when we're communicating with subjects in crisis, we are not the ones doing all the talking. It's the subject that is doing the talking. So we are not good BS artists. We are good listeners, if at all possible. You only need a negotiator. That's what you see a lot in movies. One person goes forward and talks to a bad guy. They have no cover. They have really nobody around them, and they're just talking. That's not true. With negotiations, we work as a team. There's actually 8 to 9 different positions that need to be filled when we're communicating with a subject. Just as you have a tactical team that will have breachers and snipers and people that will go forward, called the QRF, a quick response force, with negotiations, we have 8 to 9 different positions that are working together. That one person that is communicating with the subject is called a primary negotiator. Then they have a coach. That's somebody who's helping them, because it is extremely stressful, both emotionally and physically, to communicate with somebody when lives are on the line. So you need a coach, somebody that's also listening and will help you if you seem to go off direction. There's also a team leader who is controlling what's a negotiation operations center. That's where the negotiations are working. And that team leader makes sure that commanders don't come in and intrude, but yet is feeding information to the commanders, keeps that negotiation operations center quiet so that the primary negotiator can communicate effectively with the subject at hand. We would have what's called the situation boards person. That's somebody who would write on whiteboards or maybe paper that's put on the wall, information that's gleaned from the negotiations, as well as information that our interviewers, interrogators, another position on negotiation team, is developing from family and friends, because subjects don't always tell us the truth. So we interview people all around to find out what is really going on and what's happening with that subject. And they'll put that information on the board so that the primary negotiator who's communicating can just look up and be reminded, like, of the subject's name. We've all been in communications with somebody and we forget their name, right? It happens all the time. Well, nothing destroys rapport by calling somebody by the wrong name. That means the subject doesn't think that you're listening to them. So names are very important. What somebody tells you is also very important. So that goes to show there are a lot of different positions on a crisis negotiation team when we are talking with subjects. It's not just one person, despite what the movies like to show. Negotiations go tactical when negotiations fail. You've seen that a lot in headlines. Well, negotiations failed, so they went tactical. No, actually, on the reverse, we work in tandem and parallel with tactical teams. We're almost a tool that they use. Maybe it's to glean information on where the subject is inside. Maybe it's to, if the subject is about to hurt somebody, get information as to how many weapons they have inside, what's going on, and maybe bring them to a position where the tactical team can safely and effectively conduct an arrest or eliminate the threat if there's an imposing threat against somebody. So we work with tactical teams. Ultimately, though, what we're going to talk about, it is up to the subject who's going to decide what happens at the end. We can control who gets in and out of a scene, but we can't always control what the subject does. What we do, and we'll talk about this throughout, is we use active listening skills to go up a behavioral change stairway so we can influence that subject. And that takes time. Negotiators will give SWAT the plans. That's more for a law enforcement world. They think, oh, we don't really want to work with negotiators. They're going to give up what's happening. And that's not the case. We work with tactical teams, as I said earlier. Command understands crisis negotiators. It doesn't. They don't, unfortunately. Their goal is to resolve the situation as quickly as possible. I get it. And I can't tell you how many times we begin talking with the subject and the commanders come in or try to come in. Hey, did you ask them to come out? Yes, we've asked them to come out. All right, well, we need to resolve this now. Get them coming out. Get them to come out. Well, it's going to take a little bit of time. They don't understand that. And they don't understand sometimes what we need in order to resolve that crisis in time and hopefully avoiding an action imperative, which we're going to talk about. Stockholm Syndrome has said it. Everybody's heard about Stockholm Syndrome, right? That's basically where your hostages take sides with their captor. And a lot of people think that's bad. We don't like Stockholm Syndrome. But what if I were to tell you that if we assessed that Stockholm Syndrome had set in, the likelihood that the hostage being harmed is very, very low. In fact, they're probably treated very well. So would you think that that's a positive? Very much so. So as long as we assess and understand that, yes, apologies, that yes, there is Stockholm Syndrome. Well, obviously we're not, when we're on the phone with a hostage, we're not going to give them anything that we don't want the subject to know, because they likely will share that. But it's good to have in some respects, because then they won't be hurt. So I like to just touch on that, because there's been a lot of movies done about negotiators, and I know this is termed negotiator. I am not Samuel L. Jackson, although I play one on TV. So we certainly want to dispel some of those myths. It is an art. It is something that you train, and what with teaching with especially active listening skills, it's a perishable skill. You have to keep practicing it and practicing it over time. All right, so traditionally with law enforcement, and I apologize for those in the room, I think we're going to have that band to top across the top. But traditionally with law enforcement, it's very sterile, very authoritative. In fact, everything about dealing with law enforcement has that commanding presence, the uniforms, the vehicles, right? That's all instilled purposely to control a situation. Well, when you're dealing with a subject in crisis, this is going to have very negative effects. What are some of the effects you can have with this? Anyone want to say? It can cause people to be very defensive. You won't be able to build rapport with them. So imagine that. Here is an example of a negotiation that happened, and the negotiator in this incident used a very authoritative tone. Some of this might sound familiar. Can we play this?
June 12, 2016. The time, 2:48 a.m.
So, have you done something about that? Yes, I have. Tell me what you did, please. You already know that. Oh, I'm trying to figure out how to keep you safe and how to get this resolved peacefully, because I'm not a politician, I'm not a government. All I can do is help individuals. I'm going to start with helping you.
By the way, there's some vehicle outside that has some bombs, just to let you know. If people are gonna get it, I'm gonna ignite it if they try to do anything.
Okay, I understand that, and I'll pass that along. Can you tell me what vehicle? Because I don't want to see anybody get hurt.
No. But I'll tell you this, they can take out a 50 block homes.
I understand that. Tell me, in the club, do you have any injured people with you that you brought with you?
I'm not letting you know nothing.
Well, I'm trying to help you help.
Well, you need to know that they need to stop bombing Syria and Iraq. The U.S. is collaborating with Russia, and they're killing innocent women and children, okay?
I hear what you're saying.
My homeboy Cameron Sarnay did this thing for the Boston Marathon. My homeboy Munir Abu Talha did this thing, okay? So now it's my turn, okay?
Okay, let's start. My name's Andy. What's yours?
The name is Islamic soldier, okay?
Okay. What can I call it?
Call me Mujahideen. Call me the soldier of God.
Okay. So that's a lot for me to say. So can I just call you something else? Do you have a name, a nickname? Yeah. I'm here. I'm listening.
Sunday, June.
Does anyone remember when the incident that was? Actually, no, it was Pulse nightclub shooting. So it was in June 2016 in Orlando, Florida. And the individual on the phone was holding, at the time, he had killed 49 people within the club. And then he went into the bathroom, and they were communicating with him on the phone while he was in the bathroom with several hostages. The negotiator on the phone did an amazing job in the fact that he what we call verbal containment. He had him focused on the phone. Did you hear any shots while he was talking on the phone? No. So that is a win in and of itself. However, if you notice in how he was communicating, the tone of his voice, it's kind of dismissive, judgmental. You know, the subject wanted to be called Mujahideen. Okay, call him that. Call him what he wants to be called, and let's listen to what he has to say as we have that verbal containment, because we may then get more information out that we can use with our tactical team, or we can use with the subject to build that rapport with them and gain some influence over them. So the problem with your typical law enforcement way that you communicate with people, it can, as we said, diminish that rapport, make defensiveness, and create the barriers with trying to talk to somebody. Being that I'm speaking with a bunch of lawyers, if you've seen this little skit, it's one of my favorite, and it shows a traditional way of communicating.
Tempers rolling. Interview begins 14:20. Right, Mr. Murphy. Perhaps you could stop by telling us about your connection to a reflection nightclub. Didn't have any connection to it. Right. The point is wrong. And one of the directors. The same, I am sure it's the level of singing, and my questions were always in the information. I've never seen that before in my life. If you tell me about their mistakes, they were buying your jacket properly, and it's about it. But when they the same line of shit, received my expenses totaling £2,496. Well. You recognize this man?
Okay. Hopefully you guys have not seen that before. I love that for a couple of reasons. One, I miss cassette tapes. I miss making cassette tapes for people that used to date in high school. It's cute. The other is Burt Reynolds. I'm finding more and more nobody knows who Burt Reynolds is, which makes me feel old. So, but it is comical and funny. So I appreciate those of you, for those of you in the room that know who Burt Reynolds is or used to use cassette tapes as well. So that one's for you. The key to know though is, while knowledge is power, it's not influence. So just because you have all of the facts of a situation doesn't mean you're going to have any influence over the people involved in that situation. Something that you can take to like in every aspect of your life. You may know everything that's going on, but that doesn't mean you're going to influence the outcome of it with people that are involved. So people that are in crisis state. What is a crisis state? Well, it's an emotional reaction to a situation. People that are in crisis state are in disequilibrium. Their emotions are not in line with their level of reasoning. And this is usually as a result of their emotional reaction to what happened. It's not what happened that causes the crisis, it's people's responses to it. People would be thrust into crisis for things that you handle day to day in your lives. And so we're going to talk about it's actually the subject's perception that matters in something. Doesn't mean that somebody is mentally ill. It just means that they're overwhelmed in the situation. Now, in my line of work dealing with people in crisis, yes, we deal with mentally ill people. We deal with people on drugs and alcohol, but we also deal with people that are just overwhelmed about their circumstances. So we're going to talk to you about how to communicate with them. Our job as negotiators is to help the subject, assisting them handling their emotions and bringing them back to a regular coping mechanism or coping stance that they're reasoning and using their rationalization better, if that makes sense. All right. So what is a crisis state? Again, it's a intense emotional level rather than rational thinking. Maybe somebody's extremely angry or extremely depressed. And it's usually a response of something that happened within the last 24 to 48 hours. A lot of times it's multiple events that happen that build up. Sometimes in our case with crisis negotiations, that precipitating event is actually police arriving on the scene. That can sometimes trigger that crisis state at the very final end. So what we're looking at is people whose coping mechanisms have failed. Everybody has coping mechanisms that let them get by in day-to-day lives because we deal with stresses all the time, every day. Well, when somebody's coping mechanisms fail, they let their emotions take over. And then that takes over their level of reasoning. These people feel threatened. It's their needs that are being threatened. We have, of course, physical needs. Everybody does. We need water, we need food. That's your physical need to survival. But everybody has different emotional and psychological needs that helps them go forward. You think of your own self or think of other people. Like, what is it that they need? It could be a sense of belonging. It could be being loved. It could be being accepted. It could be being a provider for your family. It could be being in control of a situation and of your life. It could even be power. Everybody has that need that helps them drive. Well, when those needs are threatened, your emotions then can take over. And if you don't have proper coping mechanisms that help you get by, you'll be thrust into a state of crisis. So with a crisis state, again, we have to figure it's the subject's perception that counts. It's not ours. It may be something trivial, but it is important to them. And if the subject feels that they are in a crisis state, then they are. We should not judge them as to what's going on with them because judgment affects the ability to build rapport with somebody. So if they sense that you are judging them and they're being judged, they're not going to listen to you. So we need to help develop that rapport with somebody. And these can be many of the different emotions you might see people, and you might see your clients experiencing, especially if I feel for you, those that work family law and divorce law. Let's talk a high stakes emotion. You raising your hand and back. Yes. You're like, this is my day-to-day life, is dealing with people in these crisis settings. Well, the key to that is not judging them on what they're going through. It's important to them. So in order to build rapport with them and have some influence over decisions that they make to cope with their emotions, you need to not be judgmental with it. Here's another example of somebody in crisis.
Well, my name is Stephen Kreppein, and I cannot eventually, I'm kind of, something to do with the computer, not. Which I avoid, and I call the hard time, I don't need to be afraid, it's just that I'm going to be afraid. Everything kind of one time.
Apologies, that was really loud. I got your attention. Good. Apologies too for the language in that, but generally when people are in that intense crisis setting, they will cuss. I have been called and been heard a lot of different cussing in my day. So with that, what emotion did you hear in his voice? Anger, intense anger, right? His hard drive, panic. Yes, panic is a huge one. because his world is falling apart in that moment. A lot of us have been through that where things don't work. Cameras don't work. Something doesn't work. And that causes us to hit that we're not dealing with it and we become in disequilibrium. So we need those coping mechanisms to bring us back to a rational state if needed. What if I were to tell you that that individual, when he's making that call, he was also going through a divorce? And what happens with a lot of us, if we're dealing with a crisis in our personal life, we try to overcompensate professionally what's happening. Well, now his professional life is falling apart. So he's really having a hard time figuring out how to be reasonable, how to rationalize what's going on. We've all been in that. And think about the times where something has happened, some news has been given to you that causes you to jump into that extremely emotional state. We've all been very upset about something, very sad about something, very angry about something. Are you in a good position in that moment to make decisions? No. So what we need is to let those emotions, we need to feel those emotions, but let them move on in time and have somebody accept that, yes, that is a justifiable emotion in that moment. Let's live it, let's feel it, and let's figure out how to cope in recognizing that emotion, if that makes sense. Emotions are universal. Experiences are not. We've all been angry, we've all been happy. But what causes that experience is not the universal event. For my friend back there, that's a family law attorney. I'm not going to ask you questions, but if you by chance went through a divorce,
You can.
then obviously
That's
people
why
that,
I was late today.
right,
My wife showed up with a husband's business saying I own part of it.
Yes.
I want part of it.
right? So there, it's not only the husband, for those that may not be able to hear, husband showed up at the wife's, or wife showed up, wife showed up at the husband's business, claimed to own half of it. So you have somebody who is dealing with a personal loss of the love in the relationship, and also a financial loss or a professional loss. So that's called the double whammy that we'll get to. But yes, that person is on the edge of perhaps going into a crisis mode to the point that they will make the wrong reactions to that. And inevitably, if it leads to violence, that's when the law enforcement gets called and comes to light. So recognizing that and talking the person through that, they're not wrong for having those emotions, but some of their actions as a result of those emotions may be wrong.
I got it today. Common thing I tell people is if you react to somebody like this, in time they are controlling you.
Yes.
So if I push you back, I'm just controlling you when you're in that mood. But he said, let her do her thing, let her be the bad guy. And that got through to him. She was really upset. All the customers were there, a lot of people were there. It really mattered to him a lot. And he's got a lot of emotion about the divorce and right he was treated. So I had to walk him off the ledge. And in fact, he stayed calm and she's gone.
Well, that's awesome. So in all of those points, we're going to touch on everything that you've said to him, things that we're going to reinforce here throughout. So yes, it may seem trivial, but it's not trivial to that person. It's important to them. They feel threatened, real or perceived. Their needs are being threatened. So we have to acknowledge it and move on. Okay, so with people, when they're thrust in that crisis state and they hit that highly emotional event, their level of reasoning goes down in the gutter. Although the normal and functionally level on this slide is a perfectly straight line, we all know we're humans. It's actually wavy. We have throughout the day, different times where we're up, we're down, but generally we're in that same ballpark where we're using our reason and that we're behaving normally, as we like to say. But when something that hits us, that throws us into that crisis state where our emotions go way up high, then our reasoning goes down low. Usually with time, people will come down off of that heightened emotional state. I say usually. In my line of work, when we deal with people who are under the influence of something, or maybe are not taking their medication, well, time may not help that, or time may make things worse. So that's, as negotiators, we assess and we evaluate what exactly it is. What we try to avoid in law enforcement and what you should avoid is that action imperative. That's the need to get to result as quickly as possible for whatever reason. Commanders maybe want to stop a crisis incident because the traffic flow has been stopped and it's rush hour. And that causes an action imperative. Perhaps probably the most extreme action imperative I've experienced as a negotiator is when you have a law enforcement officer who is injured and inside a scene, and you feel that action imperative, you need to resolve it as quickly as possible so you can get the law enforcement officer who's been injured by a subject out to get medical care. One such example back in Chicago, that's where I have come from, there was a task force officer with the Chicago Police Department working with the FBI. They were conducting a search for the subject in a bank robbery, and knew he was going to be in that address. They went to that address, he was not there. Female acquaintance of his gave information that he was at another female's house. So they went to the second female's house. Well, that is a third-party residence, so they, even though they had an arrest warrant for him, they couldn't go in. So they decided to do a ruse to see if he's inside. So Joe Earhart, the task force officer, knocked on the door to see if he's inside. Well, the subject had been tipped off that the police were coming. He answered the door with a gun and shot Joe. Joe went down, he pulled Joe inside. Subject is now barricaded inside with a police officer. He's armed. He also had children inside with him. He threatened to the rest of the officers there, if you come inside, I will kill the kids, kill this officer, and then come. But you have that action imperative. You need to resolve this situation as quickly as possible because you have an injured officer inside who may be dying. In the end, what ended up, the subject felt that he was not being heard. He knew he was going to jail, so he's losing his freedom, but he also felt he wasn't being heard. So as he was communicating with the negotiators, he said he wanted to talk to a reporter to give his side of the story. They arranged that. They let the reporter talk to the subject. Subject vented, gave his side of the story, and then he put the firearm down, came out, surrendered, and they were able to get help for Joe. Unfortunately, Joe, and I say this because I always like to remember him, Joe was in a coma for about 8 years before he ultimately succumbed to his injuries. And so it's this moment to, again, recognize his heroism and what he did and that he gave his life. Doctors have said that even if he was rescued right away, Joe would have probably had the same results. However, that didn't ease a lot of tense feelings between tactical operators and negotiators. They wanted to go in right away. Negotiators were trying to say, hey, give us just a moment. Let's see if we can, didn't say in those terms that we need to meet his needs, but they recognize, let's just try to meet this need. And we think that we can then have some influence over him. So he puts down the weapon and lets everybody in safely. So again, it caused a lot of hurt feelings. It took a lot of time for those feelings to get over, but you can see how sometimes you cannot control the action imperative. You have to recognize it and see how we can work it to the best of our advantage. But those are extreme circumstances. Certainly, I hope that never is something you guys experience in your day-to-day lives with your clients, but recognizing, hey, if they're in that heightened emotional state, maybe with a little bit of time, they'll be able to come down. We've all been in those heightened emotional states, right? Not the best time to make decisions, as we said, but in time, didn't we come down from that? A lot of times, especially if it's extremely sad or extremely angry, what happens when we come down is we're really tired and we need to sleep and we need to rest. So give yourselves that time and comfort, just like give your clients that time and comfort for them to come down off of that emotional state. What causes loss with the subject? There are many different things that can cause losses. Usually it's a loss of love with a marriage, loss of friendship, maybe a loss of employment, loss of health, loss of a loved one's health, financial stability. All of those things can cause somebody to go into crisis. The double whammy, which we had talked about earlier, is somebody that not only has that personal loss, but also has a professional loss or loss of their financial well-being. Those are the people that are really going to have the most difficult time working through their emotions to figure out how can they respond most reasonably. One movie that I always like to bring up, the movie Falling Down. Does anyone remember that movie? Looking back, more in the back of the room. Not necessarily you, Kreppein. Sorry to call you out, but Falling Down was Michael Douglas's movie, 1993, I believe. Phenomenal movie. What happened to Michael Douglas in the movie, not only was he married to a really beautiful woman named Beth, so I like to bring up, just kidding. He was going through a divorce with her. And you see all of the things that just start building in him. He's sitting in a hot car, a fly is bothering him. He's stuck in traffic due to construction and you can't understand why. And he is just trying to get home to his family, but then you find out he has lost his job. And then he tries to go to get a soda pop. I call it pops, I'm from Indiana. And the convenience store raised the prices from 50 cents for those of us back then. You remember pop was 50 cents and it was awesome, or soda was can was 50 cents. They raised it to 85 and he just couldn't understand why they raised the prices over something as simple as a can of soda. And then he goes to a fast food restaurant and he wants to order breakfast. It's 11:33. Breakfast stops serving at 11:30. I know we've all been there. We've gone to breakfast somewhere and they stop serving it and you get so frustrated. Well, imagine if you're also dealing with all these other events, you might not respond appropriately to somebody saying, sorry, we no longer serve breakfast. In my head, a lot of times I want to jump across that counter and punch them, but I don't because my level of reasoning is fairly normal and I just, okay, that's frustrating. I'll move on about my day. Well, in this movie, Michael Douglas just can't take it. And so he responds with violence every time he's met with something that drives him crazy. It is a great movie to see somebody that's constantly being hit and shoved down and how they respond not in the best way. So that is a really good movie. If anybody has not seen it, I encourage you. It's bad acting because it's from the early 90s. So when dealing with people, what we're doing is we're trying to recognize what is their unsatisfied need that they have. Again, it may not be physical need of food and water, but it could be something that drives their emotional and psychological well-being. Maybe it's security, recognition, control, whatever it is. So as you're talking with your clients and you notice they're having an emotional reaction to something, listen to them, listen to how they explain things. A good way to understand a subject and what their need is how do they view that loss? What do they think is important to them? And from there, you can figure out what it is that they feel they are being threatened with and losing. And how can you acknowledge that and work with them to address a better way to cope? You may not fix their problem, but you can fix the way they cope with their problem. If that makes sense. So that is the most important thing that we can do and we recognize this even in a lot of times when we're dealing with trapped criminals. Well, it's their freedom. They don't want to go to prison. So we're dealing with people that are losing that. I talked about that incident with Joe Earhart where that particular person felt he was not understood. So he was not being recognized appropriately. Dothan, Alabama, there was another incident there where a subject took a little boy hostage into a bunker and held him there for 8 days. And that's not too far away from here. Do you guys remember that? About 10 years ago. So very good incident that shows a subject, and I've got a clip from one of the negotiations with him when we're talking about active listening skills. But for him, he was not feeling like that he was understood. He had this little boy in a bunker that one way in, one way out was a tactical nightmare for the tactical teams to figure out how they were going to rescue this little boy. He took that little boy hostage because he wanted to have a reporter come listen to his story, and when he was done, he was going to put a plastic bag over his head, fill it with helium, and die, holding the reporter's hand. He really wanted to be understood. He had a lifetime, we call somebody like him an injustice collector. He was a curmudgeony older gentleman who didn't like when neighbors' dogs would roam on his property, so he would shoot them or leave antifreeze out to kill them. Everything that happened in his life, he felt was an injustice to him. So he was collecting it over time. And what he felt like is he wasn't understood. He went to the extreme in that reaction. In the end of that, if you want to look up what happened in that, the tactical team, they used negotiators to sort of get him used to having different deliveries. And then they were able to have a delivery where they distracted him so that they were able to go in and rescue the little boy and then eliminate the threat. So if you look up that Dothan, Alabama boy in the bunker case, that's a really good crisis incident. So what we do as negotiators throughout the process for crisis intervention is we establish a relationship with them. Not saying a relationship like dating, I'm saying a relationship where we're communicating with them. We have that dialogue with them. We help them deal with their emotions, providing them reassurances that that is a justifiable emotional response to whatever it is that's happening. Ideally, we allow them to vent instead of acting out on their emotions. Venting to us and expressing to us what exactly is happening instead of acting out. We show them empathy, demonstrating it. Instead of saying, I understand, you need to show that you understand and demonstrate to them. And we could do that using active listening skills, which we'll get into there in a second. Again, with that is having that two-way dialogue with substantive dialogue, as well as clarifying what exactly is that's going on with that. Well, when I say problem solving, again, that's not what their issue is at hand. It's allowing them to come with a better coping mechanisms to what's happening, dealing with that crisis, not the actual issue that they have, dealing with their ability to manage their emotional response to what happened to them. So first, as crisis negotiators, we try to understand a subject. We use our active listening skills. We use our crisis intervention to find out what exactly happened to them that thrust them into this crisis mode. And then we assess. This is the part that you may not deal with. We assess if our incident is instrumental versus expressive. What I mean by that is in the crisis negotiations, 97% of incidences that we deal with as law enforcement officers are expressive. These are your domestic incidences where a husband is holding, or a wife, is holding their spouse against their will and committing some sort of violent act, which then drew the police response to that incident. That's 97% of our crisis incidents that we're dealing with. These are highly emotional. When we provide a police presence and response, a lot of times that heightens the emotions even more. So we'll talk about maybe lessening that visibility of law enforcement. We're not going away, but we're just going to lessen it. Maybe dressing down, not wearing uniform, something that doesn't trigger them even more emotionally. We're going to allow them to talk through their emotions, and we're going to use time to bring their emotional response down so that they come to a more rational level of thinking. And we, using that time, also build some influence and rapport over them and get them to have subjects come out. Very rarely do you have an instrumental. That's the 3% of incidences where the subject has planned this out and taken means. In the Dothan, Alabama, he built that bunker over a year's time. He had a plan that he was working towards, and he wanted the police to respond. He asked for the police response. He took a hostage who was unknown to them. Whereas in expressive situations, usually the subject knows their hostage. They know who they're taking, and their emotional response is directed at that person that they have inside. So very rarely do you have those instrumental. Those are also extremely dangerous situations. These are your true kidnapping type incidences. So for us, what we also use in crisis negotiations and law enforcement is our tactical and strategic intelligence. That's how many bombs do they have in, how many guns do they have in, how many people are around, what the family says is what's going on with the subject. So we're gathering all of that intelligence to help assess the situation and how we're going to effectively respond to it. And then we negotiate, as throughout we're negotiating with the subject to hopefully come to a peaceful resolution. Just like with your dealings and with the incident that you had with where you told the husband to control himself and not react to the wife going to the business, we deal with that too. Our crisis negotiators, the only thing that they can control is themselves. You can't control the other person, but you can control yourself. You've seen fights where people are yelling and then they're yelling back. And what does that do? That escalates the situation. Neither of them have any self-control. But if you have the self-control to listen to them, hear them, truly hear them, and respond based on what they're telling you. Don't respond based on what you want to say, but what they're telling you. And keeping that cool, calm, and collected response, you're going to get a lot further with people. So I tell my negotiators when we show up on scene, hey, if this is not your day, and we have all had those days where something has happened to us and we're just not in the mood to deal with anybody's SHIT, okay, you're not the best person on the phone today. I'm going to take somebody else who can control themselves a little bit. So just like in your day-to-day, if you are just not having a good day and you're dealing with a client who is not also having a good day, that's probably not a good time for you guys to get anywhere. Put the pause button on it. Let's reconvene another time when you know you can control your reaction to a situation. It's not about getting even in the end. It is about satisfying each side's needs, not necessarily winning. So recognizing that, and that is also how you can control yourself. What you want to do is work towards de-escalating those emotions so that you can lower the tension in the matter and lower their emotions to get them more reasonable. But you don't necessarily have to win. If somebody comes in and calls you a name, doesn't mean you have to call them back a name. Listen to what it is that's pushing them over the edge, that's causing that emotional response by them. When people talk, it is just like how this says. They have a story, but usually their story is surrounded by emotions. Not to pick on the family law person, but there's a lot of emotions in there, right? How many clients have you had? Divorce is the common denominator. It's an experience that maybe everybody is dealing with in your line of work. But some are happy, right? And some are very sad, and some are very angry. So even though they may have a similar kind of experience, they have different emotional reactions to what it is that's going on. And just the same with you, if they start telling you a story and their emotions surrounding it doesn't match something similar you've gone through, try not to one-up them by sharing your experience. It's not about you, it's about the subject. And it's about the subject's responses to something that's happened to them that matters. Their perception counts, not yours. And so taking them and listening to what emotions they are as you're hearing their story will tell you what's important to them and what's not. And what you want to use is those important things. It's the next slide where we talk about hooks. So we're listening for those emotions surrounding that content. It's not necessarily the content that is driving the crisis, it's the emotional response. So keep that in mind. It's strongly influencing their behavior. So what you want to listen to is that need that's causing that emotional response that they feel is being lost and threatened. That will drive and decide what is their hooks. What is something that is important to them? And as negotiators, we use those hooks to connect with somebody. If it's a subject who is who's holding a spouse against their will because they're upset that the spouse is cheating or leaving, okay, well, really their loss is that loss of love, and what's important to them is family. So we'll use that hook with them to talk about, hey, I understand family is very important to you. And they'll be like, yeah, family is important to me. Now we're going to work through and talking with their emotional response and how they can have a better response to the thought of the loss of what is important to them, if that makes sense. Sometimes people get very confused about what their loss is, and that's why you would just use active listening skills to dive into what is important to the subject and what is not, and listening to the subject's response of things. And they might not even realize what their response is. What is important for us to also do is have boundary settings with our subjects. A lot of times they want to manipulate you. They want to put things on you that you're responsible for what may happen in the end. But a subject, they are responsible for their own actions and and what they do based on what is given to them. So you have to remind them of that, hey, you might not be able to control the other person, but you are in control of your own actions. So we deal with that a lot with subjects that are inside, and they'll tell us, if you don't give me a getaway car, $1 million, I'm going to kill somebody in here, and it's your fault. And they try to put that manipulation, and they try to put that on us, that we are the cause of what's happening in there. When in the end, they are the ones that chose to take a hostage and barricade themselves with a firearm. They chose that. So we'll let them know, hey, listen, you are in charge of what happens inside there. We don't want anything bad to happen, but ultimately it's you who's responsible. Similarly, in your day-to-day life, you might deal with people who try to guilt and manipulate you into feeling responsible for what they do, but they are in control of their own actions. I feel like that's very deep. Like, you want to share? But it is something that happens every day, especially in our own relationships that we have day-to-day life. People try to make us feel responsible for their actions, but that's not it. I have a Peloton. I love Alex Toussaint. One of the things he said was, every day you wake up with two things: choices and chances. The choices you make determine the chances that you get. And the same with these people, and they forget that. They forget that the choices they make will determine what chances that they get. But each person needs to be reminded that they are responsible for their own actions. And that's how boundary settings come in. Why is it important to remind people that they are responsible? Is if they're manipulating you, they don't have any respect for you. So if you feel yourself being manipulated by somebody, they clearly don't have any respect for you. So they're not going to listen to you, and they're not going to be influenced by what you say to them. So you have to start all over and try and use those active listening skills to work through what's happening with the subject and build that mutual trust with them. Does anyone have any questions up to this point? Sure. Yes, sir.
You're in such a high stress environment constantly. How do you maintain your own EQ or emotions both on the day-to-day and in the long run without burnout and stuff like that?
Gross. No, I'm kidding. I'm kidding. I don't choose drugs. I get drug tested.
It's recorded.
Exactly. It's recorded for posterity. So no, everybody has their coping mechanisms that helps them, right? Mine, I exercise a ton. I enjoy it. I focus on time I spend with my kids, feeling those moments, and that helps me in dealing with the day-to-day. In an intense situation, like in that moment that I'm dealing with it, it's where I rely on my team. And I rely on the people next to me to help me. That, hey, you know, and this is being a good teammate. As you can tell somebody may be struggling, turning to your teammate and just saying, hey, I'm here with you. I got you. That helps. And doing that for each other, even with your friends in your day-to-day life, you know, as you're hanging with your friends, hey, I got you. I'm right by your side. I'm here with you. I'm here to help you. I'm not going to solve your problems, but maybe I'm going to listen to you and help you work through your own problem. Does that make sense? So kind of the spinning. But really, for me personally, it's exercise. My kids will tell me if I a little short fuse at the end of the day, Mom, go for a run. Okay. They know what I need and what I don't need. And listen to each other. You know what somebody needs and doesn't need. I really try to avoid a lot of times with law enforcement. A lot of officers lead to using alcohol as something to help them cope, but that's never really going to help. And it's just a short-term fix that will actually cause more issues and more problems. Okay. Any other questions? No? Yes, sir.
I practice on mostly personal injury work,
Okay.
but I'd like to have 5 calls like after an incident happens from the FBI, like, you know, when they took over the Capitol. Couple
I don't know what you're talking about.
No, I got a call like from the FBI on 3 people that called me, and then I called Phil Elbert, Miller, and Harlow. But it was like a matter of minutes. I wonder how in the world they must be tracking those people's phones. How would they know that that person called me? Or maybe they're tracking your phone.
Oh, you're trying.
No, like the.
I'm just kidding. So
Or that bonding thing, they called me like 10 minutes after it happened.
yeah, likely they've also called us, and they've also indicated that they've spoken to you. So that's what happens. We don't monitor everybody's phone. For those of you that have ever worked in government, you know, like, I mean, we take things to the lowest bidder. So we don't have the funding to do some of the things that is out there. But there's probably a logical reason as to if somebody called you and then the FBI called shortly thereafter, there's the logical reasoning could be that they also called the FBI and said, oh, talk to this person, he can vouch for me, and things like that. That happens a lot. So yeah. Did that answer your question?
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a small world, and people's behavior will be pretty obvious and lead back to different things. So yeah, and especially if they're a client of yours, you know, they throw your names out more than you realize. So yes, a lot of times it's we're going to sue you, and this is my lawyer. So all right, but boundary settings. It's very important, as I said, to establish that respect. Their respect for you as well as you showing that the respect for them. And it's going to be necessary. What we need to do when we're talking with is, again, not be judgmental, have a very professional tone with somebody, friendly but businesslike, and use our words very powerfully. Don't be over talking. Again, negotiator is a good listener, not a good talker. Using those pauses can help a lot when you're dealing with somebody who is in this frame of mind. Some different responses that you might have if somebody, and again, may not be a life and death situation that you guys have, perhaps, but you can use it in your own settings. If they're trying to manipulate you and make you feel responsible, and you could say, well, that would be terrible inside, but it's your choice. And it pretty much puts that onus back on them. I want to work with you. We don't want this taken out of our hands, especially in business settings and contract disputes and things like that. You have control over your choice and what happens inside. That's a crisis incident where somebody's barricaded. I'm counting on you to keep people safe. I hope you don't have to use that phrase in your day-to-day life, unless you're talking to somebody babysitting your children. And then yes, that is something you could definitely use. iMessages, and we're going to get to active listening skills and iMessages and that. The importance about iMessage is it's really only effective when you have some influence over something. So we'll talk about that when we get to it. But again, it's having that reality check with somebody that we use this all the time with crisis negotiations and subjects that are barricaded. They want us to go away. They don't want the police there because this is an expressive incident, which is 97% of the incidences again. We tell them, hey, we're not going to come in, but we're not going away either. And you're in charge of everybody's safety in there, and I'm counting on you to make sure that everybody is safe. So we'll have that reality check for them. So again, our attitude, non-judgmental. We're going to accept that that is their emotional response to something. What we want to do is control how they cope with it, not a violent act in the end. We do not inject our values. We don't say you should, you shouldn't. They don't, it's their perception that counts, not ours. If that makes sense. Cannot say that enough. So going on to active listening skills. Again, a lot of things you guys may have heard in the past, but I'm going to nitpick a lot of how we use these active listening skills. The main point of active listening skills, we want to give somebody a hearing, let them vent out. That quote, listening is the cheapest and most effective concession you can make. That is important in every aspect of your life. Just listen to what somebody is telling you. How many times in your day-to-day life do you pass somebody in the morning and you're like, hey, how are you? And you just keep on going. And what if they said, well, I'm having a bad day because I just found out I have terminal cancer. And you're like, okay, we're having a conversation. You might have just said, how are you? You didn't care what the response was and you wanted to go about. But let's listen to what their response is and what they're telling you. That is going to be a very engaging conversation with somebody. And not listening to respond, but listening to see what it is that they're telling you. And showing respect. Empathy. Empathy is not sympathy. Nobody wants to feel sorry for. We want people to understand ourselves. Everybody wants to be understood in our day-to-day life. So when you show sympathy with somebody, you're pitying them. And nobody wants to be pitied. But if you have somebody listen to you and empathize with you and try to understand what you're going through, that is going to lead a far way. You're probably going to be influenced by that person way more than somebody who feels sad and feels pity for you. You have to listen to somebody, and these are our communications techniques. Acknowledge what their point is. Doesn't mean you have to agree with them. You're just acknowledging what their point is. So you're not conceding. You're just admitting what it is that they want and what they need. Agree where you can without necessarily conceding, but find that common ground when you're dealing with people, whether people in crisis or even people in your basic negotiation settings. What you want to do is make sure that it is a positive setting where they feel comfortable exploring your ideas. Again, because you weren't judgmental about them and you were respectful with them and you used that good tone and you listened to them. That is going to create that positive setting for you. The key is not to argue. Because if you argue, they will not listen to anything that you're going to say. And they're going to be so focused on trying to prove their point that they're not going to listen to you either. People don't always say what they mean though. In those situations where a spouse may take somebody hostage inside their home because they feel like they're losing their love, they might say, I hate this person and I wish they were dead. That is not actually what they mean. What they mean might be what they do, unfortunately. But what they mean is I miss this loss that I've had. And I'm trying to seek something that will fill that. And so they're expressing something that may not exactly be what they mean, but that's what they're leading. So try to listen to that meaning. What is that unsatisfied need that they have? That emotional unsatisfied need, that psychological unsatisfied need. We are not, as negotiators, in the business of meeting somebody's demands, but in satisfying needs. If that makes sense. So behavioral change stairway. I imagine this every time I'm talking with somebody and dealing with them. We're going to use active listening skills in time, which will hopefully bring those emotions down. But throughout that, I'm going to show empathy. Again, let's show that I'm understanding them and what they're going through. Develop some rapport with them. It's mutual trust, where they're going to listen to me and I'm listening to them. And eventually, we'll have some influence over that person and change their behavior. We're not solving their problem, if you notice that. That's not the end goal. We're not looking to solve whatever problem they're bringing. We're looking to help them cope with whatever they're dealing with in a proper behavior. Help them have a better emotional response or accepting their emotions and having a better response to the situation than using violence in our cases. In your cases, it may be something else. So focus on that. And the active listening skills is really the only tool set that's designed to do all of these things all at once, to gather information to help use against, to buy time with dealing with somebody, establish that rapport, and encourage that behavioral change. So going through the active listening skills, these are all of them that we use. And a lot of times we have cheat sheets as negotiators. We'll put these active listening skills on a laminated card. Some of mine put in a wallet. I have an 8x10 sheet, and you can pull it out if need be. But we're the FBI, we like acronyms. So we came up with this acronym, more pies. Everybody loves more pies. So if you want to remember more pies and you're talking with somebody, you're like, I want to use some active listening skills, just write out more pies and then fill it in as you can. And we're going to go through each of these individually. And again, as I said, I'm going to be nitpicky on this. So I sometimes in my day-to-day life will only use active listening skills with the next person I talk to. And it's amazing the information that you can get out of somebody. I'll tell a story about that at the end. But that's the key. We as crisis negotiators, we try to only use active listening skills. And it can be very difficult because you talk to somebody and they'll respond back to you with a question. But my answer to that question is not what's important. They are important. So I'll flip the script and use another active listening skills in response to whatever question they have. It eventually will annoy them. Sometimes you just have to answer whatever question it is. But a lot of times it will be very effective to focus back on the person. People sometimes ask me, what information will you share with subjects that are barricaded inside of passages? Will you share your kids' information, things like that? Because it's you're having hours-long conversation. They sometimes ask very personal questions. So as negotiators, you have to know what your boundary is before you go in. Because again, it's not about me, it's about them. But maybe they need just a little bit of information to make me seem human, but not a lot that they will manipulate and try to use against. So yeah, I'll admit that I have children, but I'm not going to tell you their gender or ages. I'm just going to admit that I have children, I'm a mother. And sometimes that connects with people as being a fellow parent. But again, it's not about me. So I'll tell that if they keep asking me personal questions, I'll say, hey, this isn't about me. This is about you and what's going on with you and how we can help you. And a lot of times that gets somebody to refocus. Again, we want to humanize ourselves a little bit, but not enough that it's about us. It's about the subject. Because can't say enough, the subject perceptions accounts. Our voice is extremely important. In my line of work, where we deal with crisis negotiations, a lot of time how we communicate is over a telephone. I still do this for telephone, but apparently it's not like this, it's like this. So we use phones a lot when we communicate, or we use PA speakers. So tone of voice is even more important. But something to remember for you guys, 55% of how we communicate is our body language. So pay attention to your body language and how you're showing yourself, and pay attention to the other person's body language. Are they receptive to you or not receptive to you? Eye contact is crucial. If you want to have some influence over somebody, but you won't look them in the eye, they're not going to listen to a thing you say. So have that eye contact and be personable. But if you have the incident where you're dealing with them on the phone and you're not seeing them, recognize your voice is extremely important. How you say something is 5 times more important than what you actually say. Sound sincere in how you say it. You heard that clip from Pulse Nightclub. A negotiator didn't sound so sincere, did he? We all caught it right away. Sound sincere and genuine when you do. And that's why it takes practice in using these active listening skills. I'll admit there's a certain one that I struggle with and I don't use a whole lot, because when I do, I sound like a robot. I don't sound genuine. So I had that self-assessment, and that's one I don't use. Pay attention to your tone and your demeanor. So on those active listening skills, emotional labeling. That's something you can use on the get-go. You heard the guy on the phone talking about his hard drive dying. What emotion we said? He was angry. You sound angry. And just in that calm, respectful way, you're recognizing that person's emotions, letting them know that they're being understood in their emotional response to something. You sound angry. You're not saying you are angry, because that's very accusatory. So watch how you say it. I hear anxiety in your voice. Something that will pinpoint what we like to do is really fine tune that emotion. Saying upset is a catch-all. Upset could mean sad, upset could mean angry. So nobody likes to be called upset because it really is too vague. So let's fine tune, what are you hearing? A spouse that has caught their spouse cheating and holding them against, and he's venting or she's venting about what happened. You could say, you sound betrayed. Yeah, they are betrayed. And their loss is, again, that love. So if you say the wrong emotion, and sometimes that happens, then you can back off of it very easily. I didn't say that you were angry. I said you sounded angry, if that makes sense. That's what I'm hearing from your voice, is I'm hearing anger. And then if they want to clarify, you're going to listen. That's the active listening skills. Reflecting and mirroring. This is the one I'm not very good at. That's repeating the last couple of words of what somebody says. I've talked with people and you can tell they're very good. They use it all the time. That's awesome. Just be careful not to sound like a broken record, that you're continually repeating back the last couple, because we've had subjects, they'll call us out. What are you, a broken record? And then they get frustrated. I think somebody next door just saw it through the screen. So one thing that we use as crisis negotiators with this reflecting is we try to only highlight positive things that are said at the end. So if a subject says, I hate her so much, I could just kill her. I'm not going to repeat back. You could just kill her. That's not so good. Also, because we recorded, I would not repeat back some sort of curse, F you, F you, F you. No, we could go on for days. So I'm not going to repeat that back necessarily. Instead, you're saying you can also, when you reflect, you can add an uptick at the end to make it a question, or you can just repeat it back as a statement. She doesn't pay attention to anything I say, and it makes me angry. It makes you angry. That's the question, right? It makes you angry. That's just repeating back what the subject said. See how subtle that is of a difference. But again, make sure you use these throughout and not repeatedly over and over each other, because people won't really think you're listening. Minimal encourages. We all do this in our day-to-day life. This is yeah, okay. It's the head nod when somebody's talking to you in person, right? We're letting them know we're listening, we're hearing them, but make sure that you are actually listening. I always use the example of, for those of us that are lucky still have our moms with us, your mom calls you. Oh my God, if I could record everybody talking to their mom, your minimal encouragers are probably through the roof. I mean, you're doing something else. You're not really listening to your mom talk about the neighbor who keeps walking around their front yard or parking in her yard, right? You're not listening to all the things that she's saying. Make sure you are actually listening. Let's see, do we have time? This is from the Dothan, Alabama incident, and what was excellent about this is you can hear the subject talking and listen for the minimal encouragers that the negotiator is using. Oops. This is so good.
This is my brother. I helped him build a rig, clip that off rig. We went down to Panama City to make a damn good money. Our first chance in life of getting somewhere in life. And I tried, and he came up with a formula for the mix. The formula was fine. We were making big money. We did $800 tax for $50,000. But then our salesman, our drunk alcoholic salesman, cheated us out of $10,000 that deal. And then on top of that, John, my brother-in-law, he started half-assing the mix. When you come up with a formula, you do not change the formula. Yeah. And he did. And he said, oh, I said, John, we're going to stick with the formula now. We got everything right. Oh, that's okay. I got another. And so we ended up, we lost the contract when I was at McDonald's down in the last job I worked with him. It just been downtown. They said, well, I had to shut down. I had anybody work down on truck. And I don't want him. I said, that's going on. That's long. Hello. He said, no, I have to go. And I say,
So this subject for 8 hours a day, all day long, would just talk, at least until day 4. And then things changed. He became very frustrated and his anxiety level went through the roof, and we could tell that no longer was time on our side in that particular incident. But it is very difficult to pay attention. But he had some really good information he was sharing throughout there that showed what kind of person he is, what's important to him, what affects him, and what drives him. And so listening to that, that's why it's so important to have a coach next to you, because it's easy to tune out and not pay attention. But I cannot stress enough with those minimal encouragers, make sure you are actively listening to what they're saying. And not just, and thinking, what am I going to say next? What am I going to say next? What am I going to say next? Focus on what they're telling you. And that alone will show a lot of empathy towards that person. They'll think that you are understanding them. You're using that minimal encourager, listening to what they say, and then responding based on what they tell you. Open-ended questions. I want to make sure that was open-ended questions. This seems easy, right? It's the who, the what happened, how did it happen, where were you? It's questions that will elicit more than just a yes/no response, which is a closed question, obviously. It seems obvious, right? But a lot of times what we'll do is we'll say, can you tell me what happened? Is that an open-ended question? No, it's a closed question. That's a yes/no question. We think we're doing the right thing by asking that, but that's not truly an open-ended question. And in Pulse Nightclub, you heard, can you tell me what happened? No, he said. And a lot of times with people in crisis, they think that they're being manipulated too, so they are only going to specifically answer what you ask them. If you use the right tone, you can use those open-ended questions to your advantage. Instead of, can you tell me what happened? Just, what happened today? Sound sincere and sound genuine when you ask that. Versus if you ask, tell me what happened today. What's that? That's a command, right? And we're trying to shed that authoritative presence as a crisis negotiator when we talk to somebody, because that authoritative presence diminishes rapport with somebody. So we're trying to shed that. So we try to lose those commands as much as possible. Just like calm down, we're going to talk about that. In the history of history, calm down has never actually calmed anyone down. Right? So calm down is a complete command. We'll talk about something better to say about that. So it's the what happened today. How did we get here? What open-ended question would also be really bad? Who, what, where? Why? Why is a very judgmental question to ask. So avoid the whys. Instead of saying, why did you do that? What caused you to act that way? Is a better open-ended question to ask somebody, less judgmental in how you're communicating. So pay attention. And that's like I said, it can be very difficult to just make those minor tweaks and nuances to how we communicate with somebody. But very important as we move up that behavioral change stairway to have some influence over somebody and how they're dealing with whatever it is that they're dealing.
What's the difference between fault and not fault?
Fault. What's the difference between fault?
That is the difference between fault and not. Why did you do that? There's minimal.
Right.
What made you do it's like it's not even your fault.
Exactly.
Right? You're not a bad guy. Yeah. Because it's the narrative.
Yes.
Like, I'm the victim. I had to do this. Very different from I did it because I felt like hurting. Very different things.
Two very different things. One is a judgmental way of asking and one is non-judgmental. You're going to get much farther with a non-judgmental way of communicating. Because again, it goes back to their perception is what matters. And when you're dealing with two conflicting views and viewpoints on something, each one, it's their perception that matters when you're dealing with clients who are at war against each other. But obviously you're focused on one side more than the other. But to make them feel understood and cope effectively, you really have to listen to them and not to be judgmental in how they're reacting. Okay. Paraphrasing, that's putting in your own words what they're telling you. If they're saying, you know, I'm dealing with a lot of traffic and I lost my job, and you say, well, that sounds like a lot to deal with in one. That's actually a paraphrase in and of itself. So you're showing you're listening to them with what's happening. Or another example, she's always talking and doesn't pay attention to me. She's not listening to you. You're paraphrasing. You're putting in own words. That shows you're listening to them. You're understanding what it is they're telling you. Because if you can repeat it back in your own words, you are digesting everything appropriately. Effective pauses. That is just exactly what it is. You're pausing. The key is effective pauses. Make sure you're using it at the right time and for the right length of time. An effective pause is a very long pregnant pause too. I said earlier that we want the subject to do all the talking, not the negotiator. So if they're yelling, I might give a very long pause At which point they'll likely bring down their tone with me and respond like, are you listening? I'm like, I'm listening, but I can't hear you when you're yelling at me. Which goes back to an iMessage. We're going to talk about that. So giving that pause to bring them down a little bit, but also bring them back to the conversation. A lot of times it can be used if something very important was said, or they said something very important. You just pause it to let it sink in. But again, make sure that is effective and you're not using it just because you have no idea what to say. Because that's pretty obvious, especially if it's a face-to-face conversation, you will look it in your face that I'm freezing and I don't know what to say. So make sure it is effective. Here is another quick example. A crisis incident. So that particular, it's hard to hear, but he's basically saying, I killed somebody when I was 14 years old. I'm going to do it again. And he's a lot of puffery. Well, you know what? He's being very argumentative at me. Just pause. Doesn't need a response back. Doesn't need an argument back. Let them vent it out and listen to whatever it is that they're venting out. iMessages. There are 3 parts to an iMessage. It's I feel, when, you, because. What you want to use an iMessage is when you have influence. You're at that influence stage over them, because otherwise iMessages will tend to fall flat. You can use iMessages in a positive and negative way. But what we're doing is highlighting a very good behavior or a very bad behavior. If a subject is yelling at a hostage inside and threatening to hurt them, I might say, I feel concerned when you yell at that person because I'm afraid something might happen. It's those 3 parts you have to use them, because there's that power of because. People need to know why. But again, you're addressing either a very bad behavior or maybe a very good behavior. Maybe they let a hostage go. You say, I feel relieved when you let somebody go because it shows that you really don't want to hurt anybody. So you're highlighting a positive action, right? And you can use this in your day-to-day life too, whether at work or at home or whatever it is that you want to highlight, because generally you might already have influence over people at home. So iMessages can be very effective in those. Or with a client that you feel like they're actually listening to you. I feel hopeful that you're bargaining here and letting some things go, because it shows that you want to come to a good resolution overall. Whatever it is that you might do. Does that make sense? But 3 parts. I feel blank when you blank because. And identify what it is that is helpful or hurtful. Again, this is very good to use when you're at that influence stage of the behavioral change stairway. It's important to note that you might be making very good progress with a client, a subject, whatever it is, but something happens that affects that rapport and you tumble right down that stairway and you have to start all over again. In 2012 in Valparaiso, Indiana, I was a part of a barricaded incident where a subject was owed money, $10,000 by this kid. He went to collect the money and the kid squirted out the back of this residence. Again, this is 2012 and the business was Prudential Real Estate Building. So 2012, real estate, I walk in the scene, I'm trying to assess and I'm like, I think this might have something to do with the housing crisis that's going on. Maybe this guy lost money. Couldn't be farther from the truth. So this kid that squirted out the back had borrowed $10,000 from our subject and refused to pay him back. So much so, he filed for bankruptcy and listed him. And then he got his real estate license and started getting the job. For our subject, who was a millionaire, it was the principle of the matter. He didn't need the money, but it was the principle of the matter. This kid borrowed money and he is gonna pay me back. Well, he kept trying to meet this kid, the kid kept avoiding him. He eventually showed up on the day of this incident with a gun. And the secretary at the incident might have gotten annoyed over time with dealing with the subject. So he comes in again. She's annoyed. She gives him the runaround. He pulled out the pistol and hit her upside the head, and a round went off. Unfortunately for the subject, across the street, the FOP was having a fundraiser selling porta chicken. So the response time was really good. I don't know if anybody's from Indiana or if you've heard of porta chicken, but it's phenomenal. I'll just leave that as is. So response time is instantaneous. Police arrive. That teeter-totter, his emotions are super high in that moment. His level of reason is down low. The police arrive. He turns around. They have guns. He has a gun. He shoots at them. They shoot at him. He misses the officers, thank goodness. He's hit in the shoulder. He flees into an office space where there are 2 people hiding. So now he's barricaded with hostages. Do I think he meant to take those hostages? I don't think so, but that's the fact of the matter. He is barricaded now with hostages. So now we start negotiating with him, what we call voice from cover. He refused to pick up the phones. So negotiator is yelling down the hallway at him and try and communicate with him. They delivered a couple bottles of water. You would think delivering water down a hallway is quite easy, but actually as you roll water, it veers off. So there were a couple of attempts on that. Water gets delivered for his basic physical need, because we knew he was shot and we're trying to give him some water to build that rapport as we're going up that behavioral change stairway. Showing some empathy with him. He did not want to go back to prison. He was afraid of the loss of his independence and his freedom. But what was important was being recognized that it's the principle of the matter, this kid owed him money. Police offered to pay him $10,000 because, first of all, it's federally insured. And when we recover him, we're going to recover the money. So not a big deal, right? But he refused because, again, the kid owed him money, not the police. So in falling down, you'll see that it's the principle of the matter a lot of times with these things. And so finally, he releases hostages just over a bottle of water and things like that. But then he became very suicidal in his communications with us. He basically, I don't want to go back to prison. I'd rather die. He was hurt from his wound and he asked for some Vicodin. He actually had a prescription for Vicodin because he had injured his back. We could have technically given him Vicodin because it's a prescription that he had. But do I want to give him Vicodin? No, because it's going to affect his mindset. So we did not want to give him Vicodin. He had then asked for aspirin. Do I want to give him aspirin? No, because he's bleeding. And aspirin is a blood thinner, so we don't want him to bleed out. But we're continuing to communicate with him. And this is where I'm basically trying to, not me, I was the team leader on this, we're trying to develop some rapport with him to get him to change his behavior of putting the gun down and coming out. We actually had some really good influence. But then he's now barricaded alone in this room. The tactical team, without telling the negotiators, decided to use this opportunity to rescue a female who was hiding in an office a couple of doors down. And when that happened, they banged into the window, crashed, pulled her out, crowd around cheered because it's Friday afternoon in Valparaiso, Indiana. Nobody had anything better to do. So he, hearing us say, nobody's coming in there, but then he hears this, he doesn't trust us. That rapport went out the window. We tumbled down that behavioral change stairway. Had to start all over again. And the negotiator did everything they could to try and go right back up that stairway to get him to put the gun down and come out. Ultimately, it didn't work though. He shot himself twice in the head. And you're wondering, that's weird. Trust me, I was in line at the deli counter after this and I heard people think police shot him too. But no, he shot himself once in the head and then still alive. We tried to communicate with him again. He couldn't, and then he shot himself in the head the second time to the point that it succeeded in what he wanted to do. So I say that in that you might, as you're talking to somebody, think you're almost there, but something happens that destroys your rapport. It's okay, start all over again. Persevere, use these same basic skills that you had from the get-go. We teach as crisis negotiators, we don't lie to our subjects. The reason why we don't lie is, especially depending on where you live, it's a revolving door in the justice system. And so you might see them again in another crisis incident. Well, if a negotiator lied to them the first time, they're not going to believe the second negotiator that talks to them again. So don't ever lie to people that you're dealing with. Nothing destroys rapport more than lying. And if you did, for whatever reason, you have to do your darndest, and it's going to take a lot of time to make up for that lie. So recognizing that's one thing that will ruin rapport more than anything. So back to the active listening skills. The last S is summary. This is really important. What we use is we transition different negotiators In the Dothan, Alabama, where it was 7 days, that's a lot of time. We would have to transition negotiators on time to time. So when we would, the new negotiator that comes in, they would start with a summary. That's basically repeating back. It's two things. It's a paraphrase with an emotional label combined. You're repeating back what it is that they told you in your own words, and then adding that emotion. So what you're saying is you're tired of everybody taking advantage of you. And with dogs coming into your yard, your brother-in-law not effectively taking things for granted with your needs, and now you are feeling very frustrated. So you're attaching both of those emotional label with that paraphrase. Does that make sense? Really good to use after a long extended period of time. If you have any mediators in the room, use this throughout the time just to show exactly that you're listening to everybody's viewpoints and what their emotions are connected to those viewpoints. All right, calm down. We talked about that. Never works. Instead of saying calm down, I can see how angry you are. Right? Let's focus on bringing them down. I hear the anger in your voice. I hear what's going on. So you're bringing them down in your genuine tone of voice and in letting them know that you're listening without saying, I'm listening to the point. I understand. It's easy for a lot of people to use crutch. You basically are trying to say you understand without showing you understand. And a lot of times people use it very quickly when they really don't understand. So instead, I'm listening. That shows you want to understand. You want to hear more to understand what's going on. You should or you shouldn't is, again, very judgmental. So what's causing that? Again, calm down. It's an order, as we had said. And I understand it's well-intentioned, but it's a shortcut. So instead of I understand, demonstrate that you understand. How do you demonstrate you understand? Using active listening skills. Really listening to them to demonstrate that. So again, your tone of voice, very important. Being respectful, using a good choice of words, using those pauses when needed. And if you have an I message that's needed, make sure that you are focusing less on the I and more on the behavior of what's happening and how it's hindering or helping that whatever is going on. Do not use a zinger, if at all possible. It tastes so good in your mouth and you really want to. That's what you use when you're having drinks out with your buddies. Don't use it with people that are highly emotional or somebody that you're trying to build that rapport in. And some people are like, well, what's a good zinger that you can have? I always like to use well, you have the right to remain silent. Please do. That's a little zinger, right? So, but don't use it in these situations because we're trying to develop rapport. And zingers are counterintuitive to developing that rapport. It's fun to use that with buddies and it's for a good laugh, but it's not a good idea in these situations. So just to go back to, for a little insight as to crisis negotiators and law enforcement, what we may deal with, things that we would perhaps deliver. Now, keep in mind, this is what may be permissible, but even though we could do it, it's how is it going to be delivered? So I need to make sure the tactical team is in agreement to deliver anything. And in the end, it's the on-scene commander's decision as to whether we deliver anything or not. Now, if it's water, I might need to explain to the on-scene commander, hey, listen, this is important for developing rapport because I think over time, I'm going to be able to lower their emotions and get them to listen to me. When your commander might say, I'm not going to deliver anything unless they give somebody up. Well, you have to explain why that could be important. So getting the on-scene commander to give approval for something and making sure our tactical team is in agreement for delivering it. A couple of different things, but these are all things that we might be able to. Of course, with food and drinks, it's always who's going to pay for it because there's never a pot of money that pays for this stuff. I can't tell you how many times I've paid for water and food for subjects that are held inside. I never get paid back, and that's okay because in the end, I'm trying to save lives. But a lot of times and then there's also how's it going to be delivered? In a crisis scene, which I hope nobody ever has to be around one, there are so many cops that show up and nobody parks appropriately and nobody leaves their keys in their car. So it's really hard to get in and out of a crisis scene. It is near impossible. And so even to have something delivered can be impossible. There's this funny story in a prison setting. Prisoners had barricaded inside and they wanted pizza. And they wanted specifically like Papa John's pizza with pepperoni on top. Well, by the time they were able to get the pizza, it was Domino's and it had sausage and it was cold. And so the pizza gets delivered and then immediately the subject surrendered. And they're like, well, we were afraid that was going to set you off because it wasn't what you wanted. And they said, well, obviously, if you can't give us pizza, you're not going to give us what we really want. That's a joke. It didn't really happen. However, it just goes to show you nothing can happen fast. If somebody says they want coffee, plan on a good 2 hours for that coffee to get delivered to a crisis scene. But these are things that might be able to. Now, most crisis incidences actually resolve themselves within 3 hours or less. But on occasion, you will have ones, a couple of that last days. But these are things we can. Again, even though prescription drugs might be able to be delivered, you have to assess, is it going to help you or hurt you? In the incident we had, Vicodin was not going to be helpful. A lot of times we'll have people try to manipulate us and they'll ask for a 6-pack of beer or drugs. Well, these are things that we'll never get. We're never going to deliver weapons. We're never going to deliver alcohol. We're never going to deliver drugs. We're also not going to let you escape because we need to control who gets in and out, and we need to control what's happening. So we're not going, if we let you escape, we'll lose control over that incident. We're also not going to exchange hostages. Despite what you see in the movies, we will not give ourselves up for somebody that has inside. In Dothan, Alabama, trust me, people wanted to. People were giving themselves up in a heartbeat to be able to take that little boy's place, but we cannot do that. So these are all things that we're never going to do. In the end, what we want to do when we get up to that end, where we're going to problem solve, helping them deal with their coping mechanisms, it's a collaborative. So take that, and you're going to work together and collaborate on how you can work out these differences. Find different alternatives to both sides. In our situation, somebody wants to talk to a wife or something like that. Well, I want to allow you to do that, but these are our concerns. They can use those same collaborative techniques when you talk to somebody. Make sure, though, you have already reached that influence stage so that you can have that true, genuine collaborative effect with somebody as you try and problem solve. And again, it's not solving their problems. You're solving their coping for whatever emotional response to a situation they have. Common problems we see: abandoning this crisis intervention, problem solving too soon, trying to get the end too soon, showing judgmentalness, too much talking, sharing too much information about yourself and not focusing on the subject. Because again, can't stress enough, subject perception is the one that matters. Jumping to conclusions, and of course, as I said, being judgmental. In the end, to be successful, you have to control your emotions. That's that self-control. Give an accurate assessment of what's happening in the situation. Try to de-escalate those emotions, those extreme emotional reactions that is driving their behavior, so that they can have a more level reasoning way of thinking. Be flexible, creative, patient, using those active listening skills. So I'll end, and the best negotiators are good listening. I'll end on the be careful when you use active listening skills, and that's all you use. I went to pick up postage stamps in Virginia while I was out there, and I had a FBI shirt on, and the postal worker was like, "Oh, you work for the FBI, what unit?" And I said, "Oh, the Crisis Negotiation Team, how do you know?" And because he recognized it. He goes, "Oh, I used to work for the FBI." I was like, "You used to work for the FBI?" Look, reflecting, mirroring, right? And I'm not very good at that. And he's like, "Yeah, I did. I worked for the Crisis Management Unit." I'm like, "Oh, when was that?" Open-ended question. He said, "Well, it was about 8 years ago." I'm like, "Oh, what happened?" He's like, "Well, they let me go. They said lack of candor, but I'm trying to get my job back." I'm like, "Oh, you're trying to get your job back?" And he said, "Yeah." He said, there were 3 trials and it was a hung jury each time. At which point I had the most long, effective pause of my life. More so because I'm thinking, how the hell do I get out of here? And I look behind me and there's a line of people and their interest is piqued too. And he's like, "Well, yeah, it was self-defense. I mean, she had a knife, so I had to protect myself. And so I shot her." And at that point, I'm like, "Oh, I saw this Dateline episode." It was on Dateline. And he had killed his wife because she came at him with a knife, apparently, and they were going through a divorce and this and that. And so just be careful when you use the active listening skills with strangers. You never know what information you're going to get. But if you choose to do that, because as I said, it's a perishable skill, is these active listening skills. Try to stay on it and not go off of it. And it's very interesting what you may learn about somebody. Hopefully you don't learn that they're a killer, but that's all right. This is one final clip. For those of you, if you need to leave, because I know you may have to go back to work, go ahead. This is what oops.
And I can feel it, like literally feel it in my head, and it's relentless. And I've been through the most, but we don't know if it's ever going to stop. Stop trying to fix it.
I'm not trying to fix it. I'm just now. Nails.
You always do this. You always try to fix things when I really need for you to just listen.
See, I don't.
So I leave you with that. It's not about the dam. Listen to what he said. It sounds really hard. What active listening skill do you think that is? That sounds really. So emotional label, I hear that a lot, but hard is not an emotion. Okay? That sounds really hard. It's a paraphrase. Paraphrasing everything she said to him. All of that sounds really. So that's I leave you with. Again, you can use this in any part of your day-to-day lives. Any questions? Sorry. Thoughts? Yes, sir.
So, I'm wondering when you have kind of these impossible demands, you know, I want the hostages rescued, or I want them to stop bombing the Middle East or whatever. You go through all the steps, you build the rapport, and at the end of the day, you know, they start with this impossible demand. And so what's like, is there kind of like a last step of what, I mean, when you do everything right, and then how is that type of thing?
So with a lot of those where they like want bombing stopped. Some those are usually instrumental where they're asking for their police response because they want something in exchange from the police. So what we're using in active listening skills then is to lower their expectations to what they're going to get. So they may not get it, but maybe we can build some rapport and have some influence over their immediate actions and continue that dialogue with them. So again, we're taking them out of how they're handling it, coming up with a better response to how they're handling it. And it could be even, hey, you know, we'll help you speak to different members of the politicians that you need to, you know, how is it that we can redirect you from this act of violence to something that might help you get what you really want? Takes a lot of time, but instrumentals are very difficult and much more difficult. Or sometimes we're just buying that time so that we can come up with a really good tactical response. That's the sad part of my job, but it happens. But again, it's that boundary settings. It's the subject inside. They're in control of what happens and doesn't happen. Ideally, we're going to influence them to change their behavior, but ultimately, if they make very bad decisions, they make those very bad decisions.
So is it kind of, you know, convincing them, you know, okay, let's calm down. We're not going to get
Stop
this
saying calm
done.
down.
Yeah, don't do that.
Yes.
It would feel that way, I guess, but eventually hope that they realize that what they're wanting can't happen. So let's just kind of get us free from walk out of here, even though you're not.
Right. That's exactly it. What we're going to assess is this person willing to stay alive though? So we have to, if they go into a situation, they've decided that they are going to die in the end, that is very difficult. And what we transition them to of assessment is how can we safely get everybody out and eliminate this threat, which happened in the Dothan, Alabama. He was communicative for the first couple of days, but then he realized he was not getting what he wanted. You'll see if you look into that incident, he actually killed the bus driver before taking the little boy off the bus because the bus driver would not give up the little boy. So we knew he was going to hurt somebody if he didn't get his way because he's shown evidence of that in the past. And throughout those couple of days in the bunker, then he started to have very negative behaviors. He was not paying attention to the boy. He was very short fused on the phone. And we knew that time was of the essence. He gave a deadline, 5 o'clock tomorrow. And if I don't have what I need, then I'm going to blow this thing up. So they had to make their tactical assaults when they did and rescue the boy. And no operators were hurt. So that is a huge success that negotiators were able to use that time to help the tactical operators develop a really good plan to go in and rescue the boy. Any other questions?
We have one that came from the chat, which is what further reading would you recommend on this topic?
Oh my goodness. So there is, and I'm suddenly blanking, but I think there's a lot of really good former FBI negotiators who have written books on crisis negotiations, and Stalling for Time is a really good one. That's Gary Nesner. I'm totally blanking on his name, but there's Art of Persuasion is also a really good book that I would read. I love the book, oh my gosh, Gift of Fear by Gavin DeBecker, which really isn't necessarily about negotiations, but it's about reading people and understanding. But I love that book, Gavin DeBecker's Gift of Fear. I recommend it, especially for any young women going to college. I think that's a really good one for helping them understanding and trusting their gut and emotions on dealing with people. So yes, but I think if you just Google crisis negotiations, former FBI negotiator books, a lot of them are good. Because I don't get paid back, so I don't remember exactly. Just kidding. Any other questions? Well, I thank you for your time.